Alright guys, so in our last video we learned about the sociological imagination, and we're going to apply that today to see how sociologists see their world. We're going to be looking at the development of sociology and early sociologists and their theories, and essentially the creation of sociology. So now that we have an idea of how sociologists approach their analysis of the world, we're going to turn that lens of sociological imagination to sociology itself. And remember, the sociological imagination is the ability of individuals to see the relationship between events in their personal lives and events in their society. So it's the ability to connect your personal life to society and see the ripple effect of our personal decisions. As a field, sociology is a relatively young discipline, and numerous fields like computer science could not exist until a certain technology existed. Like with computer science, that would be computers. Sociology is very similar. We needed the sociological imagination and that lens through which we can see the world to exist before sociology could exist. And that technology, if you will, could only have been developed within a certain time. And that time was arguably the 19th century, when the French scholar Auguste Comte invented what he called social physics, or positivism. And that is where we are going to begin. So like I said, sociology is a relatively new science, and it began in the late 19th century in Europe during a time of social upheaval. The social and economic effects of both the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution were touching all aspects of life, and people were moving from farms to factory life, and they were losing a sense of community. Some European intellectuals were fascinated and troubled by these sudden changes in society, and they began to grapple with the ideas for bringing back that sense of community they had had when they were all living on the farm. And they wanted to restore order to society, and those ideas led to the rise of the sciences. Alright guys, so Auguste Comte was a Frenchman, and he is considered the father of sociology. His main concern was the improvement of society, and he thought if societies were to advance, society and social behavior had to be studied scientifically. And because no science of society existed, Comte attempted to create one himself, and that's why he's called the father of sociology. He wanted to use scientific observation to study social behavior, and he called this positivism. And positivism is the belief that knowledge should be derived from scientific observation, which we can be positive or sure of things. So he basically brought the scientific method into studying social behavior. He thought that if our ideas about society were to be considered valid, then they had to be backed up with scientific observation. Comte published his theories in a book called Positive Philosophy, but he died before people really came to appreciate his work. His belief that sociology could use scientific procedures and promote social progress, however, was widely adopted by European scholars like the ones we are about to talk about. Okay, Harriet Martineau, she was someone that did appreciate Comte's work. She was an English woman and another important figure in the founding of sociology. She was born into a middle-class home. She was never in very good health and lost her sense of taste, smell, hearing, all before she reached adulthood. Her writing career included fiction as well as sociological work, and it began after her family's textile mill was lost to a business depression. And so without her family's income, she was forced to seek a dependable source of income to support herself, and she became a popular writer and even had celebrity status in England. And her work originally even outsold Charles Dickens. She is best known today for her translation of Comte's Positive Philosophy. Her English translation is one of the most readable ones, and despite being severely hearing impaired, she made original contributions in the areas of research methods, economics, and politics, and also feminist theory. So she introduced feminism. She saw a strong link between slavery and the oppression of women, and she was a strong, outspoken supporter of the emancipation of both women and enslaved peoples. She also believed women's lack of economic power helped keep them dependent upon men. And by writing about the inferior position of women in society, she helped inspire future feminists that would come after her. Our next European sociologist is Herbert Spencer, one interesting guy. So he was the sole survivor of 9 children, and he was born into an English family. He was taught exclusively by his father and uncle, mostly in mathematics and the natural sciences, which will make sense a little bit later. To explain social stability, Herbert Spencer compared society to the human body, which was interesting. He explained that like a body, society is composed of parts working together to promote its well-being and survival. So people have brains, stomachs, nervous systems, and limbs, and societies have economies, religions, governments, and families. And just as the eyes and the heart make essential contributions to the functioning of the human body, religious and economic institutions are crucial for a society's functioning. So I'd like us to pause for a moment and for you guys to work with those around you to select a part of the body that represents each part of society. You're going to use Herbert Spencer's theory yourselves. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. So Herbert Spencer compared society to the human body and thought that all the parts were working together to promote its well-being and survival, but he also had another very interesting theory that I want you guys to remember. Okay, he introduced social Darwinism, and that was based on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Spencer thought that evolutionary social change led to progress, provided people didn't interfere. He thought that if left alone, natural selection would ensure the survival of the fittest in society. On these grounds, Spencer opposed social reform because it interfered with the selection process. The poor, he wrote, deserve to be poor, and the rich deserve to be rich. And he thought society profits from allowing individuals to find their own social class level without outside help or hindrance. So basically, social Darwinism is the belief in the survival of the fittest socially, and Herbert Spencer opposed social reform because it interfered with that process. Spencer visited the U.S. in 1882, and corporate leaders saw his ideas as moral justification for their competitive capitalist actions, and they warmly greeted him. And later, support for government intervention increased, and Spencer's ideas began to slip out of fashion when people began to embrace social reform and the efforts to help the poor. And he reportedly died with a sense of having failed. But his contribution to society was a discussion of how societies should be structured. And it's a very interesting thought, the survival of the fittest socially. So why would someone disagree with Spencer's idea of social Darwinism? Turn to the person next to you and talk about that for a minute, and then we'll talk about it as a class. So our next European sociologist to talk about is Karl Marx, and you guys are probably familiar with Marx. He was a German scholar and didn't consider himself a sociologist. He studied law in Bonn and Berlin, and he took up philosophy after meeting some like-minded individuals. And after completing his legal studies, Marx became a journalist and eventually the editor of a radical newspaper. Nevertheless, his ideas have had a major effect on the field of sociology. He felt great concern for the poverty and inequality suffered by the working class of his day. His life was guided by the principle that social scientists should try to change the world rather than merely study it. So that's one thing I want you to remember about Marx. He thought that social scientists should change the world, not just study it. Marx identified several social classes in 19th century industrial society, and among them were farmers, servants, factory workers, craftspeople, owners of small businesses, and moneyed capitalists. He predicted that at some point all industrial societies would have 2 classes: the bourgeoisie, a class who owns the means to produce wealth, or the factory owners, the upper class, and the proletariat. That's the class of workers who are paid just enough to stay alive. For Marx, the key to unfolding history was class conflict, a clash between the bourgeoisie, who controlled the means for producing wealth, and the proletariat, who labored for them. So just as enslaved peoples overthrew slaveholders, wage workers would overtake capitalists. That's what he predicted. Out of this conflict would come a classless or communistic society, one in which there would be no powerless class and no powerful class. So as you know from world history probably, Karl Marx developed communism. He thought that a planned revolution would speed up the change from capitalism to communism and take care of this class conflict issue. Although he believed that capitalism would eventually self-destruct, his political objective was to explain the workings of capitalism in order to hasten its fall through revolution. And before we continue, I want us to stop for a moment and look at these two words and practice their pronunciation and talk about where they came from. Okay, our next European sociologist is Emile Durkheim. Okay, Durkheim was the son of a French rabbi, and according to Durkheim, society exists because of a broad consensus or an agreement among its members. We all have to agree on something to exist as a society. Although early European sociologists of his time emphasized the need to make sociology a science, they did not have the research tools that are available today. Later sociologists developed the research methods to replace speculation with observation to collect and classify data and to use data for testing social theories. Durkheim was the most prominent of these later sociologists. He first introduced the use of statistical techniques in his groundbreaking research on suicide. So he was the first to use statistics in the study of human groups, and specifically he studied suicide. In that study, he demonstrated that suicide involves more than individuals acting alone, and that suicide rates vary according to group characteristics. And remember, sociologists always look at the group. Durkheim showed that human social behavior must be explained by social factors rather than just psychological ones. So remember that he believed that society consists of a broad consensus, and he was also the first to use statistics. He was also the first to teach a university sociology course. Okay, Max Weber. He was the eldest son of a father who was a well-to-do German lawyer and a politician. His mother, in contrast, was a strongly devout Calvinist who rejected the worldly lifestyle of her husband. Weber was affected psychologically by the conflicting values of his parents, which led at one point for him to have a mental breakdown. As a university professor trained in law and economics, Weber wrote on a wide variety of topics, including the nature of power, the religions of the world, law, economics, rural and urban sociology, and the nature of social classes, and even the development and nature of bureaucracy. His most famous book was The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and that was published in 1904. Through the quality of his research and the diversity of his interests, Weber was profoundly influential in the development of sociological theory. He's very important. He believed that human beings act on the basis of their own understanding of situation, and thus sociologists must discover the personal meanings, values, beliefs, and attitudes underlying human social behavior. Weber believed that an understanding of the personal intentions of people and groups can best be accomplished through the method of Verstehen. Okay, and that's understanding social behavior by putting yourself in someone else's shoes. He believed that putting yourself in someone else's shoes allows you to shed your values temporarily and see things from a different point of view. So that's probably something you've been told your entire life, to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And Max Weber kind of developed a scientific study and scientific name for that. Weber also identified rationalization as a key influence in the change from a pre-industrial society to an industrial one. Rationalization is the mindset that emphasizes the use of knowledge, reason, and planning. And the influence of rationalization marked a change from the tradition, emotion, and superstition of pre-industrial society. For example, agriculture became grounded in science rather than belief in luck, fate, or magic.